everyone. Welcome to our call with Antony Alpert. Antony is the originator of the Flourishing Business Canvas. Antony will go ahead and get started. If you have a question or reflection, type it into the chat and we will go from there. Antony, up to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's delightful to be here, and I want to start by thanking you all for choosing to participate in this. I have to say that this sort of exercise, it's the first time I've ever had an opportunity to do something like this, and it's an absolute gift. I was really enjoying reading the collective narrative yesterday afternoon and this morning, and you've really done an amazing job of covering the waterfront. Very theoretical questions in there. There's very practical questions. There's some really, really big picture questions. There's some really small scale questions and comments. And then you've also got some historical questions and comments and some future orientated questions and comments. So by all three of those dimensions, you've done an amazing review in your World Cafe of the waterfront around the idea of flourishing and flourishing enterprises and the tool, the Flourishing Business Canvas. So it's an absolute gift that you've given me here. So I really wanted to start out by saying how grateful I am for that gift. So given how broad and deep you've gone, I was a bit challenged because I don't want to take up all the time with my talking. I would like us to have a conversation. So I thought I would pick just two sections of the collective narrative and maybe offer some comments on those, and then we can go wherever you'd like after that. One of the areas that I wanted to comment on was getting more clarity about applying the Flourishing Business Canvas in specific contexts. And there was a question, some of you, I understand, are permaculturalists, and you were interested in how perhaps it might apply in your context, but also you were thinking about how might this apply in contexts where people don't have a worldview that's aligned with flourishing today, and how might that work. So my thought on this is that I think there are two big theories of change that we have at the moment. One is based very much on analytical thinking and forecasting, and it's basically saying that we can take the current world and we can evolve it incrementally to be at least minimally viable in the future that's emerging. And a good example of this would be the United Nations Sustainability Goals, which are all about incrementalizing our way into a future where we're sustainable. And the second theory of change, which is the one I would put the permaculturalists and many others in, is that we need to basically start again from scratch, that we need a ground up rebuild of our culture and our society. And the idea then would be in that theory of change that it's so attractive, these new communities, that it draws people from the existing culture into these new communities, and then those communities slowly grow and become the dominant paradigm. And of course, a normal change adoption curve applies to that you get the super early adopters, the early majority, etc., and finally the laggards on the other side. So I think those are the two theories of change, and I'm personally attracted more to one than the other, but I don't think that either is falsifiable. I don't think you can prove that one of those theories of change is right and the other one is wrong. In the first theory of change, the one where we're incrementalizing, the role of the canvas in this theory of change certainly allow a certain degree of sense making. So people coming to the canvas from that perspective of we're going to incrementally change our business, our culture, our society. There's certain things that people can easily make sense of. People know some of the words that are on there and they can relate to them and they can sense make, even if they don't get it technically correct, they'll sense make to some degree. But then there's also some terms which one of my colleagues, Peter Jones, has labeled strange making. So this is the idea that some of these terms are deliberately chosen because they are not going to be familiar in the dominant culture today. So a good example of this would be biophysical stocks, or ecosystem actors would be two of the examples of that. And the idea of that is we're going to get a range of reactions to that, and we do get a range of reactions to that. Some people just ignore it and go, I don't understand it, I'm not going to pay any attention to it. Some people reject it and say, I don't understand why that's there and I don't want to know, and maybe even to the extent that they're put off using the tool at all. And then there's a third group of people, which are the ones that I'm most interested in a certain sense, the ones that ask the question, why is that there? And when they ask that question, of course, they're putting themselves into a mode where they're willing to be, it's a teachable moment. They've opened themselves up to the possibility that there's something that they don't know, and therefore it's possible then to inject some new ideas and new thinking in there, and therefore bring them along to some of the ideas that they need to think about, even in the incrementalist theory of change. On the other hand, if we're looking at the second theory of change, what the canvas offers, because the claim is it's got all the necessary and sufficient factors to completely define a flourishing enterprise, for the intentional communities movement, so the permaculturalists and many others, the canvas offers the opportunity to design the most radical business models that you can imagine. And it has the capacity to represent those as well. And I wanted to just observe that I've done a fair amount of work in the first theory of change. I've not done very much work in fact, I've done no work in the second theory of change yet. And I'm actively looking for an opportunity to engage with some people who are in the intentional community space, who are interested in defining some really radical business models for organizations in and around their community. I have had some conversations. Some of you may know Joe Brewer. So I have been having some conversations with Joe, but it hasn't turned into anything practical yet, where, all the stars align of everything that needs to happen. So I thought that was my first comment that I wanted to make around applying the canvas in specific contexts. The second one I wanted to go to was you had a section entitled Identifying Pitfalls and Articulating Strategies for Large-Scale Transformation. I actually want to challenge you here on what I think is an assumption behind this question or this observation that you've made. And obviously I'm interested in organizational scale and a microeconomic scale, if you like. And so the assumption I think you've made is that existing organizations can in fact transform. And I would say there's a growing preponderance of evidence that that is not the case. If you go into the classic business school press and you go look for all the articles about skunk works and adopting substantially different business models, you won't find very, very many success stories. You're going to find mostly failures for larger organizations to transform themselves. And another piece of evidence that suggests that large organizations can't transform themselves is the changing membership of things like the New York Stock Exchange 100. I think there is now only one company on that listing that was there 120 years ago, which is General Electric. And of course, they've largely become a conglomerate, and so buy and sell businesses in order to be able to adapt. On the flip side, from a theoretical perspective, we've got things like the adaptive cycle and panarchy, which, if you look at that, you'll notice that when an organization gets up to the top right quadrant, it's highly adapted for the very specific circumstances that it's dealing with, its particular niche in terms of product and customer and market and all of the other factors. It's got very highly attuned and has become extremely efficient at serving that market. And what panarchy suggests is that the next step in the cycle, if something was to change in your environment, I mean, very similar to the idea that, you've got some birds who are adapted only to be able to get the pollen out of one particular flower. They've got a very long beak and the flower's got a very deep floret where the nectar is right down at the bottom. And if you think about that for an organization, that could be a significant shift in their market. It could be a new requirement coming out of their customers. It could be a new law or regulation. It could be a number of different factors that cause the context to change. And in this situation, what panarchy suggests is that the organization will collapse. It won't be able to transform because you can't transform without going through collapse and reorganization. So even if the name would stay the same, by the time the reimagined organization got back up to the top right-hand corner, it would be unrecognizable to its past self. And in many cases, all of the resources in the organization would have been dispersed and reorganized. So that then maybe comes back to the question, why work with existing organizations at all? Why not just let them all fail? Because they're, according to panarchy and other evidence, the likelihood is that they are all going to fail because they won't be able to adapt to the changing circumstances in the world. And the answer to that is it's all about the people. While the organization may not survive, the people in the organization absolutely will. And what we want to do is to train those people so that they're ready to take the best advantage of the collapse and the reorganizations when they happen. Now, obviously, from a societal perspective, if we believe that that's the process that's going to unfold, we would be very wise to be looking after those people in terms of a universal basic income or something like that to allow them to leave those organizations proactively once they see the writing on the wall. Whereas at the moment, what tends to happen is people will fight the end of the organization because they're trying to protect their own livelihoods, which is very, very understandable. So a couple of different points there on existing organizations. But I have to say that the most successful use of the canvas so far has been with entrepreneurs. We've seen a far greater take up in the entrepreneurial space than we have in the established business space. We've had both, but I would say there's more activity going on in the entrepreneurial space. So that was my second comment, and I think I'll stop there and really just open it up for questions. I can go anywhere else you'd like in the collective narrative, or we can talk about something completely different.
Yes, we have a question from Kenan. Kenan, go ahead and get us started.
Great, thanks, Tatiana. So yeah, and the question's a little bit enigmatic. As a founder of an organization to reimagine science, I myself am a scientist, and I do tend to see science everywhere. It's a core part of our current technological society, for better or worse, even where a lot of people in society are separated from science, who feel that it's very much the ivory tower. And what I've been really interested in is looking for a way to create something similar to sociocracy, holacracy, distributed empowerment models, not only for working in science, which seems a really far cry from how it is right now, but also between different organizations that are working to create change. So I was wondering what your relationship is to science, and have you been finding yourself traipsing across individuals that would identify as being part of the scientific establishment? And I hope that's a succinct enough question. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you for the question. My original academic training was in computer systems engineering, so that's not a regular science in that respect, but it is experimental in some respects. You can say that computer systems engineering is experimental. So I've got an affinity to it. I grew up in an environment where science was considered to be the best way we have of understanding the world around us. So I very much grew up in that culture. And I continue to believe that the scientific method, which is, of course, a social process, scientific truths are socially constructed. They're not absolute. But I still believe that that's the best way we have of understanding the world. However, I've come to believe over the last decade or so that even when we start to have different philosophical stances within science, positivist versus subjectivist, it would be a good example of this. There are other ways of knowing, there are other epistemologies that become really important for us to think about. And of course, there are branches of the scientific community that would claim ownership over these areas, but I see them as something complementary to the idea of science in a certain sense. So one of them is ethics and morals. When you're designing a new business, yes, you would need to understand the practical realities that science can tell you about how things are and how things are likely to be and what things are possible. But what it can't answer is the question of what's desirable. And that's where ethics and morals comes in. In my view, it helps you understand what's desirable. And then there's a third component, which is humanity has a much longer tradition of ways of knowing than science. Science is relatively recent. And in some cultures around the world, this other way of knowing or ways of knowing is still predominant. And that's, of course, the indigenous way of knowing, the way of knowing that we would have had for the vast majority of human history. And many cultures have managed, despite colonization and much else, have managed to retain that indigeneity. And for those that have lost our indigeneity, and I put myself in that category, there are things you can do to go back to try and reclaim it. And so I think there's some deep indigenous wisdoms which can help inform what's practical. What do we know works? And I think deep indigenous wisdom can really help with that. So designing business models I see as those three factors together. And I would tend to put them in that order at the moment, but I remain open to giving them an equal priority or changing the priority order. I don't know if that answers your question, Kenan.
Yeah, I'd love to do a quick input before we go to the next question, which is I was going to say I'm almost in tears, but I'm actually in tears, especially when you got to the second one and then going to the third. Those are absolutely the domains that we and I operate in as well, while considering it to be a core part of what science needs to be. And I hate to use the word needs, but for society, I think it's actually core. So I love Nicholas Maxwell's work, and I do believe strongly in this idea that values-based science is very much the needed near future.
And that's why I took a design science approach to the original research, right? Because it's an integration of normative ideas, what you believe is true, plus the truths that science can tell you. So that's exactly why the design science approach is so critical.
Hello, everyone. My question is, we were talking about the transition system, both the offboarding and the onboarding. So the question is what are the practices that you see being most effective in helping the humans in this transformation, in this transition? What can facilitate this offboard and onboarding process? I'm thinking both like rituals, artifacts, anything that you think that would be of assistance on these two loops.
Yes. I think the short answer is we don't know. And I would say that organizations and the work of the Institute of Evolutionary Leadership are a response to the fact that we don't know. So I'm going to pontificate a little bit here rather than claiming that I have any sort of insider knowledge. So I mentioned in my opening remarks that the canvas has on it both sense-making and strange-making aspects. And I think that that's really important because at a certain level, you have to meet people where they are. You can't make people learn. And in fact, as a sidebar, you can't make anybody flourish either. All you can do is create the possibility where people could choose to try to flourish, but you can't actually make anybody flourish. So you can't make people learn. You've got to get them into a situation where they want to learn. And so in the tool use, where of course I won't be present 99.99% of the time, the sense making is meant to draw them in. And then the strange making is meant to prompt them to start asking questions. And of course, hopefully the question is, first of all, what is that? But then the second question, which is the really important one, is why is that there? Which of course prompts double loop learning, and therefore the possibility that triple loop learning will have, in other words, a change in the value system and the worldview that somebody has so that they can incorporate the response to the question, why is this question on the canvas? So it's a balance of those two things is my experience so far. If you only strange make with people, they'll turn off and they won't learn anything. If you only sense make, they have no possibility of being brought forward into new ways of seeing the world. I think I'll leave it at there and see if you have a follow-up question that I can expand on a little more.
I was just trying to explore on your experience. It's something that you see more effective. Like I've seen a lot of games, a lot of trying to use like Ludo, some Ludo playing to try to do that. Someone that's been trying, if there's something that you see that works more than another thing.
Again, I think this is a very interesting area that needs a lot more work. Gamification of this process, I think, becomes very interesting. I'll just give one example, which isn't quite a game, but it's a simulation. One of the things that you noted in the collective narrative is that designing flourishing business models is a co-creative process. It can't be done by one individual. It can't be done in a problem-solving mode. It has to be done from a positive place, from an appreciative place. What that implies is that an individual entrepreneur can no longer design their business model for their enterprise by themselves. And in fact, this was actually always true, but it's been in our dominant culture that entrepreneurs are meant to be heroes and that the entrepreneurial process is meant to be a horrible process that one time out of 100 is successful, except we hide that fact from most people most of the time. I've got an analogy which I'll share perhaps later on, but about that if people are interested. So the simulation we developed was to give the entrepreneurs an experience of convening the other stakeholders in their business model and then running a design session, actually facilitating a design session to co-create the business model. It's a very limited simulation so far, and it could be expanded dramatically. But again, as usual, the challenge is how do you get a group of people in a room in a way that's economically viable for everybody to be able to run simulations like that. So gamification, yes, simulation is a big part of that.
Because I am trying to actualize this model, Antony, I would like to invite several teams in the village where I'm going to have interdisciplinary scientists, artists, all the STEM people, plus the entrepreneurs, plus the locals, plus the government decision makers. Could we do this tool that you are providing in a week's time and design the future community? Have you done it? Is it possible? Can we do it?
I think you would be, if not the first, but one of the first to try this that I'm aware of. It may have happened elsewhere that I'm not aware of. The short answer is yes. But I have given what you've said in the question here and your comments just now, I need to give you a couple of pieces of advice. One would be, don't show the canvas to start with. What you want to do first is engage your community in the questions that the canvas asks. So ask them, what do you think is a stakeholder of this organization we're going to try and create together? And who do you think the stakeholders are? But don't show them the canvas with that question on it to start with. Ask them what value you think the organization needs to co-create with those stakeholders. Ask them what needs do they think the stakeholders have. So you can use the 16 videos, one for each question, and you could show those videos and then ask people to discuss each of those questions to start with. The second thing is that there's a limit, even if you print the canvas out big, and in fact, I don't know if you can see it, but I've got a large tube behind me here with some canvases that are about 1.5 meters by 2 meters, which is about the largest practical size that you can print them, and there's a limit to how many people you can get to practically stand around a canvas and actually work effectively together, because the process of using the canvas, it's the negotiation of the words that go on the sticky. That's the magic, right? That's what creates shared meaning as opposed to the understanding of an individual. So practically more than 4 becomes quite difficult. 3 to 5 is the range. 4 is ideal, I would say. Then if you've got 20 people, what do you do? My answer to that would be split people into groups and have multiple canvases going at the same time, and then do a synthesis at the end of some description. And that's probably a multi-step, multi-event type of thing, because people will need time to reflect. And the last piece of advice I would use is when you do start using the canvas, use it in a systems thinking way. Don't use it in an analytical way. The way that people have been taught to use canvases historically, and the way that you'll see them used in a lot of the videos online, is each question is considered an opportunity to fill out a list, to create a list of responses to that question. And the problem is, once you've done that, even with the original 9 questions on the business model canvas, the questions that historically we've believed lead to short-term profitability, what you'll end up with is 9 times 5 responses. And that's so many more times than any one person can comprehend. By the time you've got to the last box, you've forgotten what you put in the first box, and you've got no idea how the answers are connected together, which of course is the whole point of a business model. It's meant to be integrative. So what we've discovered is that the better way of doing it is to start out by asking people just to fill out 1 sticky on 3 boxes. And the 3 we start with is stakeholder, value co-creation, and activity. And once the group has put those, what you do is you split the group into 2. One pair puts up 3 stickies that they negotiate between the 2 of them. And then they have to tell the story of those 3 stickies to the other 2. The other 2 then critique, and then they swap roles. Now, eventually they get good enough that they can do design and critique at the same time, but this is a very designerly way of doing things. It's called designer observer. And if you do that repeatedly across the whole canvas, slowly but surely what happens is you build up the ability for people to tell the complete story, despite the fact that there's 40 or 50 stickies on the canvas. In the YouTube channel, there's a case study where you'll see me tell a finished story. And I invite you to take a look at that and think about how much you could understand versus if I just listed what's in each box. And I think you'll find that it's quite different, quite a lot less. If you become a first explorer, then there's quite a lot of materials about this now that we've got to share with people. So that would be something to consider, perhaps. It's very exciting what you're planning to do. I look forward to hearing more about it.
Very good. Duna, go ahead.
I feel pretty complete. Christiana was able to contextualize. Yeah, I was going to ask you, Antony, to share more about the process with the entrepreneurs and who's around the table and how to fill the canvas. So really.
So we've built a method for the use of the canvas with entrepreneurs, and another method for the use of the canvas with leaders in established organizations. The one for entrepreneurs is called the Flourishing Startup Method. And it deals with questions like, how can I aim for a better future if I don't define that future first? Once I've defined that better future, how can I assure myself that my first step towards that future is actually taking me towards that future in a useful, productive way? So it does those very high level questions. How do I deal with the fact that at that scale of thinking, I'm going to have to iterate because it's a designerly process, and I may have to pivot. I may have to change my direction quite considerably, but how do I change direction but remain true to my values? How are my values personally and the values of each of the people who are creating this new organization, how are those aligned with one another, and how do those fit with the purpose of and the values of the organization? So these are very big picture questions, a very long way away from putting stickies onto the canvas. So that's kind of the methodological scale, if you like. The next scale down that we've got at the moment, and I'll comment on where I think we have a gap, is what I would call the process of business modeling. This is the idea that you need to convene the stakeholders, for example, that you then need to talk about which stakeholders have power, that you then need to figure out what needs the stakeholders have and what value you're going to co-create with them, and then work through. So I'm now going through the parts of the canvas, if you like, but not at the sticky level, at the level above that. And of course, dealing with realities like you won't get the list of stakeholders right the first time. you're always going to miss somebody. You're almost likely to have somebody who turns out not to be relevant over time. And then how do you all of the normal art of hosting type of things that you've got to worry about to introduce new people into a community that's been going for some time without them feeling that they've been excluded in the past, and without the existing community feeling like they're wasting their time by having to invest in bringing the new person up to speed. So that's kind of the process level. And then the most detailed level is what I would call the practice level. So that's what I was just talking to Christina about, this designer observer processes at the practice level. What we've uncovered fairly recently in the last weeks and months, and I'm not sure yet if it's a level or something that complements several levels, which is that when you put a sticky on the canvas, if you're designing a new business, one that doesn't yet exist, or an evolution to an existing business that doesn't, where the future model doesn't yet exist, everything you write on a sticky is a hypothesis. It's your best guess based on everything that you know about what you think that a useful response to the question is going to be in the future. That then leads to the question, are you confident enough in your hypothesis that you should want to carry on with this line of thinking in your business model? And so it becomes necessary to integrate into this process some sort of validation process for the hypotheses behind the stickies. This idea of hypothesis testing is very well developed in startup culture worldwide. It's the basis for the lean startup approach that's now used in practically all profit-centered entrepreneurial programs worldwide. Obviously, when we're testing hypotheses, we're testing them much more broadly than just will it make money, informed by the values and purposes of the individuals and the organization. So I think we've got this other piece. As you can see, it kind of resonates with the method, the process, and the practice, but quite how it integrates into all three of those, or if it integrates into one of them better than the others, or if it's a whole new layer, I'm not sure yet.
Is this outlined in that document, the different layers that you've mentioned now?
Well, for the first explorers, we did a webinar about this, where there's a diagram that describes what I just said in that presentation, but I don't think I've got it posted anywhere publicly yet.
My question is about moving from the business model canvas to what I would call a bankable project. I come from a background of finance and consultancy, and I've been doing a lot of business plans in my life until I moved to permaculture. Once, let's say we've developed in consultation, we have a good conversation with all the stakeholders, develop our narratives, our stories, and come up with an acceptable, a beautiful project. But at some point in time, I probably need funding. Now, I know there are investment funds dedicated to social and environmentally friendly projects. These projects need to show measurable social and environmental impact. Is there any process or methodology eventually to move from this business model canvas and eventually to quantify all these ideas, all these things, put them in numbers so that eventually we can come up with a business plan which makes sense to investment analysts?
It's a great question. One of the complexities that working in the space adds over traditional profit first thinking is that we have many more things to think about at the same time. If you have a values-based purpose for your company, for your organization, whether it be profit or non-profit, you're imagining a future society in which your organization will be viable. And you're trying to help bring that society into being, as well as bring your organization into being in that society. The challenge is, if you were to design that business model for that future state and then bring it into the present and do your financial analysis on it, it wouldn't be financially viable in the present state, because law, regulation, market preference, customer preference, and many, many other factors won't align with the way that you hope that they will be or plan for them to be in the future. The journey that you're on is actually like a three-way tug of war between this current state and this future state. The three ways are: you have to remain viable in the current conditions, whatever that definition of viability is, based on where you are and who you are and who's measuring you and what your own goals are and all of those sorts of factors. You have to remain viable, because if you don't remain viable, you won't ever exist to help bring about the future that you want. And the challenge is, how do you do that while remaining true to your values? That's the challenging part of that. The second piece is that at the same time as being viable, you have to be viable enough that you can invest in bringing about the future state. Because if you don't invest in bringing about the future state, all you're going to do is continue to operate in a viable way, which of course won't bring about the future. You actually need to generate more surplus in the short term in order to be able to invest in the longer term. And the third piece is that you have to do both of the first two while doing as little harm as possible, or preferably some good. So you've got this three-way tension that you're always dealing with when you're trying to define a near-term next business model, it means that if, for example, the funding requirement is that you have a certain return on investment, then if you want that funding, you have to come up with a business model that's going to meet that need, even if it means you have to give up some things that you know ideally in the long term you want, because otherwise you won't be viable. It's as difficult and as straightforward as that, I'm afraid. One of the things we have to point out to investors, particularly if they have a longer term time frame, for example, a pension fund that has a 60 to 90 year time frame in mind, or should have, is that the financial risks of ignoring the social and the environmental are going up day by day. In my experience, it's increasingly the case that you no longer even have to make an overtly environmental or an overtly social beneficial argument. You can simply point to how these social and environmental factors that are changing are going to impact materially financially on your business model.
We have a raised hand from Manuel.
Antony, good to see you.
Very nice to see you too.
And thank you for your contribution very much. Appreciate it. You reminded me when you were talking about the limitations of the size of the printout and the sticky notes, reminded me of work that I did with 2 clients many, many years ago. And they had 50 creative engineers that were going to design the next generation of cameras in a room. And they had the whole 4 walls covered with paper. I would say that using an entire space, it may be the next size. Don't limit it by how much you print.
So canvases are only ever designed to show a summary.
Yeah.
They're not designed to show the detail. So they're a good place to start and they're a good place to finish. But there's a heck of a lot that has to go on between starting and finishing, where the canvas will help you scope that work, but it won't help you do that work. So validation is one of those things, and you have to think about the hypothesis and go out and do your testing, your interviewing, your research, and then bring back that evidence and then confirm or disconfirm each hypothesis. But there's another aspect, which is that every box on the canvas actually has well-known tools and methods associated with it that have been used for ages. So, for example, stakeholder analysis is a well-understood process, and there are well-understood tools for doing that. In the activities box, we know how to do business process mapping. We've known how to do that for ages. Right. So I very much support your idea, Manuel, that if you're going to do this seriously, you want to have some sort of exploration space, and the canvas would be there to act as a summary. Maybe at the end of each session, you retell the story that's on the canvas, updated based on the new work you've just done in the last day, week, month, whatever. And around it, you'd have all of these other tools and methods throughout the working of all the other tools and methods.
The second thing is, have you considered, and maybe you have already put in the donut economic model as the context for the canvas?
Explicitly, no. Implicitly, yes. The canvas itself is based on the same set of science that the donut economics is, so that the justification for why the questions are the questions is informed by the same science that informs the donut economics model. The next question you have to ask is, when you put a sticky on the canvas, if you believe donut economics is right and you're aiming to design a business that would be within the donut, how do you know that any one sticky that you put on the canvas is supporting that goal or not? And that's where the idea of design principles comes in. This is an area where we need to do quite a lot of work. At the moment, what we've done is we've taken a science-based measurement system, which is the Future Fit Business Benchmark. It's 23 do no harm goals and it's 21 positive pursuit goals. And we flipped those measurement questions around into design principles, which is not ideal, but it's a good stopgap for the time being. So then you've got a way of assessing, as you're putting stickies on the canvas, are these stickies going to lead me to being able to have my enterprise within the donut?
All right. Anthony, essentially Cleo's question was, how can one become a first explorer?
That's very easy. You send an email to inquiry@flourishingbusiness.org and say, I'd like to become a first explorer, and you'll be taken through the process. The process is deliberately hard because we don't want everybody becoming a first explorer yet, although we're getting very close to the point where we're going to be opening it up further, but we haven't yet decided exactly how we're going to be opening it up. But it's a bit of a back and forwards, but the idea is to only get people who are super keen on making the investment to try it out. If you respond very quickly to each step, of which there's 3 steps, it'll probably take you a week and a half, something like that, to go through the 3 steps.
I really appreciate business model and the thought that you did with everything. And the canvas I thought was a really interesting approach as a tool. But given that it's like a tool, how is it dealing with kind of some of these larger or more complex up and downstream supply chains? And if you thought of that, is there an idea or a process that you're thinking of that where your model or your canvas is influencing or rubbing up against up and down that supply chain? Because I think that from a service sector, you could probably do this. This would make total sense, everything you're saying. But in a product manufacturer, economies of scale, people start looking for profit, don't have visibility into where things are made or how they're made. And so just trying to understand a little bit about how you see those larger constellations happening.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you used the word constellations rather than value system or value chain or value network. That's definitely the word we've been using, is a value constellation. And I would argue actually that services do have material impacts. And one of the challenges we have today is that the service provider isn't very aware of them, but they're in their supply chains, the material impacts. A restaurant, for example, itself doesn't have any primary production of any kind, but yet it's dependent on massive amounts of primary production of one sort or another, of extraction of resources from the planet. So the short answer to this is that we have a theory about how to do it, but we've not had a chance to test it yet. And the theory is informed by some earlier practice, which has been done successfully in the profit first world. So it's not a completely unknown thing. And just to use the canvas as an example, the middle section of the canvas is what's unique to each business. So I don't know if you've noticed, but the 4 boxes, the 2 on the leftmost side, the 2 on the rightmost side, have a funny sort of shading around them. And that's to indicate that those are actually shared by all businesses in the world. If you wanted to model multiple businesses at the same time in a room, for example, we'll go back to another exploration room that we could do, Manuel, you'd take the middle section of the canvas and you'd repeat that as many times as you have organizations in the value constellation. And then you take the outer boxes like the biophysical stocks, the ecosystem services, the actors and the needs, and you put those at the extreme ends. And yes, I know it kind of starts to look like a linear flow, but you have to deal with that the best you can, given that we can only, put a sticky up to about 2.5 meters high. The idea is you put those canvases on the wall, you'd invite all of those organizations into the room, and whether you're designing from scratch or you're designing an improvement, you then go through a design process using the canvas. And of course, as one person puts on a partnership for the supply of a material, the next person in the chain or the nearby neighbor in the constellation puts that organization on as a stakeholder, and then they have to figure out how they're going to co-create value in order to meet that need. So you start to be able to build up the chain across the canvases. Interestingly, the ontology that powers the canvas, it's actually much, much simpler to do it. It's just very, very hard to represent it on a 2-dimensional piece of paper. But it's the way I've just described it is the way we'd like to try it. So if anybody's aware of an opportunity to do that, let me know, because I'd love to figure that out.
My question is how or are there some basic leading and lagging indicators that you notice that shows the process is working?
In the field of business modeling, one of the things that we're lacking, irrespective of the business modeling tool, is any longitudinal data at all. And part of the reason for that is that the connection between designing a model and whether or not you get the intended outcome in the world, there are so many other factors between those 2 steps that it's very, very difficult to ascribe cause and effect. To know that a certain metric is leading or lagging at a certain time. So that's the basic challenge that we face in this space. I mean, I think, say with entrepreneurs, if you see an entrepreneur who's very reliably putting up a sticky, realizing that's a hypothesis, going out and getting data to support that hypothesis or to disconfirm it, and then coming back, that's a leading indicator that that entrepreneur and that enterprise is more likely to be successful than somebody who's just putting up stickies and then assuming that that's going to be the way it's going to work. Mm-hmm. So that would be a leading indicator. Actually, not just for entrepreneurs, actually for established businesses as well, because they have the same issue. So that would be a leading indicator.
Very good. Thank you, everyone. That's a full hour of beautiful questions. I think we had such a great discussion. Antony, what is something that you want to leave us with?
I think what I'd like to leave you with is an invitation, which is to try it in your context, in your world, with your understanding, and see what happens.
Very good. Very good. This was a fantastic session.
We really don't know what we don't know in this space at the moment. And we've done 7 years of testing on this so far, and we're learning new things every day. And we're aiming to have an impact at a global scale. So there's so much variety in the world, we can't possibly hope to absorb all that variety and attenuate that variety into a small project team. So we absolutely need many, many people trying this out in many, many different contexts, and then to be reporting back on their experiences. And that's the idea of the First Explorers program, is to facilitate that process. And then hopefully we'll figure out how to do that at an increasingly larger scale. So the invitation is try it. Inquiry@flourishingbusiness.org.